Welcome to Titan HST's Business Continuity Today, hosted by Todd DeVoe, where planning meets reality.
Hey, welcome to Business Continuity Today. And so don't judge me by my success. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again. Nelson Mandela. And I think it's a great quote for going into resiliency, what we're going to be discussing today. So why is resiliency important? Resiliency is especially important today because in the business environment and in government, it's becoming more dynamic and unpredictable. And this is a result of several enduring forces stressing and stretching our systems right now. So whether it's the technology with the process of cyber crimes that are happening, COVID, climate change, any other kind of pandemic that comes our way, and of course, the rising political and social stresses that are happening today across the country, across the world, in generally speaking. So, there's no better example of system stress than what we're going through with this pandemic, with COVID crisis, and humans are impinging on the natural environment. They have enhanced and risk of other issues that are happening. And as we see the natural world creating, I guess, for lack of a better term, new and unique diseases that are coming out, I don't think this pandemic is going to be the last one that kind of touches us. We've dealt with things like SARS and MERS and Ebola. Emergency managers, emergency planners from across the globe have been predicting, not necessarily predicting, like saying it's going to happen at this date, but the idea that we have to be ready for a pandemic. And in the case of COVID right now, I mean, we've been lucky in the sense that we don't have more deaths involved with this unique virus that has spun up and is out there doing its thing. So what are some of the challenges specifically for having your organization to be resilient? Let's talk about a couple different things. So organizations have designed predominantly to respond to the political winds of the private sector, and they are there to maximize their shareholder or stakeholders' values, whether in the private industry with dividends and stock appreciation, or in the case of the government organizations, the political whims of the elected class. So very few organizations even attempt to measure resiliency beyond merely disclosing specific material risks, and it goes back down to the risk assessment. Organizations are going to focus, and often focus, on maximizing the short-term returns. And they're not looking for those long-term solutions to problems. And we see this all the time, especially in government agencies, where we have deferred costs. Think about road maintenance and things like this. If you take a look at our infrastructure with bridges and whatnot across the country, a lot of them have D- ratings. And because we keep deferring, it's a long-term problem, and the short-term solutions aren't there. And so the political class, the politicians, love to push those things off and take things out of the budget, right? Because it's a long-term fix. They're looking for short-term wins so they can go out and show their constituents that they're doing things. But sometimes those long-term wins do not work for them. So organizations focus mainly on creating and executing stable plans, right? And that works well, I suppose, for the short term. But if you take a look at these long-term plans, it's scary for them. The risk is high because it's in some cases it's not clear or predictable, and it changes. So you have to be separate Gumby, right? Always flexible. And resiliency deals with the unknowns, right? We've talked about this in the past. Changeable, unpredictable, and in some cases improbable, that has significant consequences. So to wrap your head around the resiliency concept becomes hard sometimes to articulate to people who are looking just for those short-term gains. So those are some of the challenges that we have. So managing for resiliency requires more than just putting up a plan, putting up some cool infographics, if you will, try to get people excited about these things. It requires a fundamentally different mental model of organizations and businesses and government. And it's one that embraces the concepts of complexity, uncertainty, interdependence, and systems thinking, which we've talked about, and also the concept of timescale perspective. And we'll do another whole thing on timescale perspective here coming up soon. So many organizations undertake some form of risk management, but they're mostly understanding their exposure to what their known risks are. And it's hard sometimes to identify what the unknown risks are, right? Or the unidentified risks. And then how do you take a look at those unidentified risks, right? And then consider the adaptations and the transformations that must happen to really address those unidentified or unknown risks, right? And so that's what the concept here when we get into structuring your resiliency plan. So organizations can structure their decision-making process for resiliency by embracing 6 principles of the long-lasting system that was introduced by Martin Rees and Simon Levin in 2017. And they argue that biology can provide some inspirations. And I love the fact that, especially with resiliency, we look back at biology and ecology for really what a resilient system is, right? And looking at the biological systems that evolved priorities and so robustness and resilience and multiple time scales, right? And so if you take a look at, say, Chernobyl, for instance, the biological aspect of it over there, where there's actually items that are over there that are thriving now since humanity has left, even though it's still has a high level of radiation and most humans would get very sick by being over there. You see wildlife coming back. So redundancy buffers a system against unexpected shocks, right? And then we get into so redundancy. So let me go through these really quick. So redundancy, diversity, modularity, adaptability, prudence, and embeddedness, right? And now with redundancy, it buffers the system against unexpected shocks, right? So we talk about having redundant systems here, say, for instance, communication, whether it's going to be cell, satellite, mesh networking type of things for communication. All right. We always want to have redundant communication. So we work in that aspect anyway. Right. And then you go into diversity of responses. Right. And so, again, the concept here, we've used this for years. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? Don't put everything into one section. Have or even in investments, we talk about diversifying your portfolio, right? So that kind of just makes sense. So you want to have that same concept when you're writing your plan. Modularity, so it allows you to move things around. It's a less rigid plan when you take a look at this, right? You can divide things into smaller chunks. You can move things around as you need them. If you think about that concept as well. Adaptability, kind of like modularity, if you will. Adaptability is to be able to be flexible enough to pivot when things need to be pivoted. And we talk about the concept of pivoting during disasters. So making your small incremental decisions so you have the ability to turn and move quickly. And that's where we go with adaptability. You got prudence. It involves operating and the principles here, something that is plausible can happen. Eventually it will. And so you really need to go through and look at those risk assessments and then sit down and figure out what the unknowns are, right? And doing that, the black swan, if you will, what are the black swans that you're looking for? And it goes back into the concept of the gray rhinos, right? So black swan versus gray rhinos. I think that we have more gray rhinos that they're there, we see them, we just don't recognize them as a threat. And so we have to take a look at those things, figure out what our gray rhinos are, and recognize those threats and plan for those. And, embeddedness is the long-term success because organizations are embedded by supply chains, business ecosystems, economies, society, natural ecosystems. All right. And so understanding and articulating those purposes in which a organization aims to strive in its societal needs. And so that's the idea of embeddedness. So beyond these structural options, an organization can deploy multiple strategies coming forth, which require both the organizational intelligence and the mental agility to see new risks and the opportunities that are posed by these risks. So if we take a look at the concept of what we're doing here with this pandemic, what are the opportunities that we can find during this crisis to be able to move the idea of business continuity and emergency management, into the next phase. And then there are the strategies of environmental shaping, right? And that concept here is establish where you want to go early on, and to be able to it's same with like the opportunities, right? And mold that into something that's a positive and not a negative. And we do this in different ways, right? By shaping the way rivers can flow so we're not flooding and things like this. That's shaping the environment, right? And we can do this with our plans as well and with our organizations, right? Shape the flow. So just to wrap up really quick, how do you become a more resilient organization? Seek advantage in adversity, right? Like I said, find that positive in the negative. Look forward, right? Always leaning forward. It's something that you hear me say a lot. Lean forward in the crisis, right? Looking for, again, that long-term planning process, right? Not that short-term planning process. Be collaborative. And I think we do that a good job as emergency managers and business continuity managers we are collaborative, right? We can't work inside that vacuum, right? And measure beyond just the simple KPIs, the key performance indicators, right? Look at what the performance is of your plan, right? Test that plan often and make sure that you can be flexible enough to move that plan to work for your organization. Prize diversity, right? We should really look at ways to make ourselves a diverse organization, right? Being able to use the concepts of modularity and being able to use those small bits to be able to make a more stable organization structure. And then change should be the default, right? Change should be the default. And I think that's one of the things that you should really embrace the change. You see the fact that change is hard for most organizations. I think as emergency managers and business continuity managers, we have to embrace change. We have to create a culture of change in our organizations that's okay when we have things that move. So when the mainstream business education and government education and managerial practice focus on managing key performance indicators, resilience represents not just an opportunity to mitigate risk, but also an opportunity for competitive advantage for enterprises who can choose to focus on it. Andy Warhol famously said that in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. Well, in today's business continuity world, transition high performance is commonplace, and sustained performance by resilient organization that stand apart. Until next week, stay safe, stay vigilant, stay hydrated.